Hey, my name's Nate, and I've been inching closer and closer to game dev. But I did run into one pretty large mistake, and that was choosing a large Metroidvania as my first project, and I came into contact with a lot of scope creep. So after 3 long months of work and figuring out different problems, I decided that I could use a little bit more experience. Therefore, this is Baudo's Winter Game Jam. So to begin, me and 2 of my friends joined this game jam. We definitely wanted to do a tower defense game, so we started with that. And when the theme Impending Storm came out, we decided to add it in as a mechanic in the game, where there's a storm cycle that randomly happens and can affect and nerf your towers. Then, you would need to place a specific type of tower to reverse these effects. This would add a lot of strategy to the game. Now, I had a few objectives to this game. The first of all being enemies. I needed good enemies. Then towers and UI. Part 1, enemies. Now I needed a couple different things for enemies. I needed them to have path following, I needed for them to take damage, and I needed for them to deal damage. So considering all these things in mind, we're going to go in order. For path following, after considering a bunch of different options and nodes in the Godot engine, I decided to use a Path 2D node. This would allow me to place points and create different paths based off different maps that I wanted. This allows me to create dynamic levels, and even works with a Path Follow 2D node, which would be the parent of my enemies, and this way they would naturally follow the path that I set. Then, in a node script in the game scene, I would just instantiate which enemy I want. Then, for damage taking, I decided to just add a collision shape. But since it was under a Path Follow 2D node, the parameters didn't match up. I would need a body-based node as the parent. Therefore, after considering a bunch of different options, I decided to just add a body-based node as a secondary parent. Then I could add a collision shape underneath that node, and it would work just fine. Then, I would connect a signal to the collision shape every time an item that would do damage would overlap with the enemy. And boom, he could take damage. Now the final thing I needed to do was have them update their animations based off the directions, as shown here. So I had a pretty simple idea, which turned out to be a little bit more complicated than I thought. You basically just track the previous position and then change their animation based off that. Part 2, towers. Now my friend wrote most of the scripts for the towers, but let's still look at it. So we had an AoE tower. This basically had a detection area to see if enemies were in its range. Then a secondary area 2D that would tell an enemy to take damage. Then I would just connect the signal to when it's dealing damage, and then this internal signal would do damage to the enemy. Now for the bullet tower, it's very similar. We also have an area tracking shape to see if there are enemies in range. But what we do, instead of just setting an area 2D that deals damage, we do a calculation that shows which enemy is the closest. Then we rotate the tower based off that. And then every time a timer goes out, we spawn a bullet, and then this bullet is what does damage to the enemy itself. When the bullet spawns, it flies in a straight direction at high speed, so it always hits an enemy when the tower shoots. Then we do another internal signal. Now for the weather mechanic, I'm not going to go too in-depth, but it's essentially just a node that controls weather. Every time this node goes off, it sets a random variable to true, and then when this global variable is true, it affects a tower in a given scene, as shown here with the fog storm. Part 3, UI. So there are a couple of necessities for the UI. First of which being buying towers. We need to be able to buy towers and also sell towers. Then the final UI would be navigational UI. So starting with buying towers, I started with a control node for organization. Then under this node, I created a placing panel with a flow container for even more organization. Then this flow container held smaller panels that contain information for different towers. Then in the placing panel script, I wrote a variable for each type of scene, one visual and one physical for each tower. When you start placement, which would be an input in a panel, you spawn in a visual version of a scene, and this would allow you to choose where you want to place the tower. Then, when you drag and release to a certain position, it catches that input and spawns the real version of the tower. This creates a drag and drop type of feature. Then, essentially what I do is I load each input signal for each tower with separate parameters. This way you can decide which tower you're actually loading. And that's about it. With this system, I can create a scene that allows you to drag and drop towers just like this. And that's it. For selling towers, all I did was go to the bullet tower scene and add a button. Then, in this button, I would write in the price that you get back from selling the tower, as shown here. Then, in the script, all I would do is create an input for this button, and then when it's pressed at any given time, you get back a portion of your currency, and then the tower would delete itself. So that way you can't sell it more than once. Then in the main UI, all I would do is create a separate button, and this button would control a global script that would make it visible or not visible, just for quality of life. This way the screen is not constantly crowded. And finally, I just need to add some navigational UI, whether it was a title screen, a level selector, or finally, a pause menu. And with that, I was done. Now I'm going to show some gameplay while I talk about some other things. In relation to the art, it was done in a short amount of time, so I'm not really going to go too in-depth into the art. But just know that my friend helped me with a good amount of the animation. And finally, the music was also done by my other friend. Feel free to play this game on my itch page that I'll link in the description. Anyways, please subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and see you later.